Good morning. I am doing my research project on the Christian worship communities that was created by enslaved individuals in early America. I have always been fascinated by these situations like the Holocaust and slavery, and how someone can find their faith in God and maintain it in such a dire and horrible situation. So I've done a ton on the Holocaust. So I was like, I'm going to do slavery. So a few things that I learned that I didn't know before is there were things called hush harbors. And they were in remote woods, swamps, cabins where people could gather away from surveillance and be able to worship. And the sounds were muffled by blankets, streams, natural barriers, kettles of water, so that they could pray and shout and sing and worship God without being heard. I think it's really interesting how they used the creativity and caution to just have biblical worship. So enslavers would emphasize the Bible, and they would use, references about obedience, like slaves obey your master, and the invisible institution, essentially that's what it was called, the invisible institution. They would focus on stories of deliverance. So if you're looking at Moses and the Israelites and leaving Egypt, and then Jesus is suffering, or Daniel in the lion's den. I think the biggest thing for me, and what I kind of related to, not so much discussed, but the biggest thing that I looked at was Moses and the Israelites and being kept under Pharaoh's keep. So it is interesting to me because you saw a lot of these leaders that would emerge from the hidden worship spaces, and they would center around community building, educational rights, and the civil rights movement. And this gave them, this basically birthed the theology, or this basically allowed them to birth theology that confronted oppression. And from that, you're going to see this movement trickle. Frederick Douglass's diaries, the slave narrative, is really powerful and really interesting in his take, and I do talk about that. So a lot of the enslavers really feared slaves meeting because they believed that this worship could foster rebellion and unity. And then slaveholders, their society becomes a contradiction, because God in the Bible, Jesus is love. And how can you justify that, right, with cruelty and slavery? And I do kind of go into detail on that, but Frederick Douglass said, there's a clear difference between Christianity of Christ and Christianity of this land. So I think that this topic is really important because it shows that slaves were able to reimagine, where they worshiped, and were able to, essentially reclaim a sacred spot, worship, and, still praise God in such a horrible, horrible time for them. And then they were able to just use, basically it was communal resistance. So they were worshiping God, but they were also resisting what was going on by having these, these meetings and stuff. So I did a lot of primary sources for like slave narratives, plantation journals, and sermons. And yeah, my whole thing was how do people find God in the midst of suffering? And how faith survives. So, all right, thanks. Bye, guys.